In the 5th century BC, the seafaring state of Carthage launched one of antiquity's most daring voyages. Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian explorer of legendary renown, sailed beyond the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, venturing down the west coast of Africa. His journey is recorded in a logbook attributed to Hanno himself, a rare first-hand account of exploration from the ancient world. This expedition chronicles the founding of new colonies, the establishment of far-flung trade routes, the exploration of unknown lands, and contact with various peoples. But perhaps most importantly of all, it also includes what could potentially be the first written description of gorillas in history. Carthage was founded by Phoenician colonists, and by Hanno's time had become a dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians inherited from their Phoenician ancestors a tradition of long-distance sailing and exploration. By 500 BC, they controlled Mediterranean trade routes and were eager to find both new resources and new markets. A chief motivation for Hanno's expedition was likely to secure West African gold and other wealth. Gold from trans-Saharan trade had become vital to Carthage's economy in this era, and a sea-based trade route could cut out some of the intermediaries. The city's leadership also saw an opportunity to found new settlements along the African coast, both to expand Carthaginian influence and to relieve population pressures at home. Thus, Hanno set sail with a fleet of about 60 ships and a sizable contingent of men and women. His logbook claims he brought an improbable 30,000 colonists and sailors along with him. Modern historians dispute this number and suggest the true amount was likely closer to 5,000, which still amounts to an absolutely massive expedition. Notably, most of these individuals would be dropped off in what is now Morocco, with only Hanno's elite crew venturing into sub-Saharan Africa. Equipped with food and trade goods, this fleet passed through the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the vast Atlantic beyond. Hanno's voyage down the West African coast began with the establishment of colonies in what is now Morocco. 2 days sailing beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Hanno founded the first city called Thymiaterion, located in present-day Morocco. Notably, the logbook is somewhat vague about the location of all settlements, a fact that historians believe paradoxically lends credibility to Hanno's account. The reason for this is because Hanno, writing a contemporary account, didn't want the location of the colonies he founded to fall into enemy hands if they should find the logbook themselves. But let's get back to this incredible voyage. The fleet then proceeded along the coast until they arrived at a destination called Cape Solis, also located in present-day Morocco, where they built a temple to the sea god. Sailing eastward a half-day from that cape, Hanno's crew encountered a coastal lagoon teeming with wildlife. Notably, he commented that elephants and other wild creatures grazed among the reeds. This could have been one of the marshy inlets along today's Moroccan coast, a vivid reminder of North Africa's rich fauna in antiquity, now lost to time and human expansion. Continuing on, Hanno reports founding 5 more settlements: Caricon Tychos, Gita, Accra, Melita, and Arambes. These sites were likely small trading posts or colonies, and archaeologists have indeed found traces of Carthaginian presence in this region, providing verification for Hanno's voyage. By establishing these outposts along the Moroccan Atlantic coast, Carthage extended its reach and paved the way for safer staging points before pushing farther south. Beyond the new colonies, Hanno ventured into less familiar territory. The logbook recounts that after the string of Moroccan settlements, the fleet reached a great river called Lixos, where they encountered the Lixites, a people herding cattle on the riverside. This river might have been the Draa, now in southern Morocco, which is the longest river in the modern country. The tribe received the Carthaginians kindly. and Hanno stayed with them long enough to forge friendships and acquire interpreters for use on his voyage. Continuing southward, Hanno's fleet sailed along a desert shoreline for several days, aided by the Atlantic trade winds and currents. They eventually came to the Bay of Kern, where they found a small island. On this island, Hanno established another settlement, naming it after the bay. He noted that, by his reckoning, Kern lay exactly opposite Carthage. This meant the voyage from Carthage to the Strait of Gibraltar, and then to Kern, took as long as the initial journey from Carthage to the Straits. The name itself is believed to be a Greek corruption of a Punic word, meaning last outpost. This suggests Kern might have been near the limit of prior exploration. Scholars have debated Kern's location, though no consensus has ever been reached. That said, possibilities include a small island in the Bay of Arguin off today's Mauritanian coast, or perhaps another island to the north off the coast of the Western Sahara. In any case, Kern likely served as a trading post at the fringe of Carthage's known world. From this site, Hanno pushed further into tropical Africa, an area virtually unknown to the Carthaginians. Before long, they came upon a wide river, populated with crocodiles and hippos, an awe-inspiring sight for the northerners. This was likely the Senegal River in West Africa, though this hasn't been confirmed with certainty. The mention of hippos, largely unknown in the Mediterranean world, lends credibility to the account, indicating the explorers had now reached sub-Saharan ecosystems. They had once been present in Egypt, but were long extinct by Hanno's time. Interestingly, there's no mention of the acquisition of gold at what is presumed to be the Senegal River. Some historians speculate that Hanno's expedition obtained gold dust or other forms of gold at this river and doubled back to Kern before venturing further. The Carthaginians may have deliberately omitted explicit mention of gold to keep their commercial discoveries secret from rival powers. After likely resupplying and regrouping at Kern, Hanno and his group of voyagers embarked on the most exploratory leg of his journey. A bold sail into the unknown South Atlantic for 12 days beyond any established route. As they progressed, the coast grew ever more foreign. The narrative notes that the land was populated by people whose language was completely unintelligible, even to the Lixite interpreters they picked up earlier. This suggests the fleet had passed beyond the Berber and Saharan cultures of northwest Africa into regions where completely different languages were spoken. It's been speculated that this was perhaps the beginning of West Africa's Guinea coast. Hanno mentioned stopping at one spot where the woods were aromatic and colorful, hinting at new spices or dyes that could be of interest back home. Again, due to this being a contemporaneous logbook, the full details aren't provided so as not to tip off the competition. Passing beyond these coastal highlands, the expedition rounded a headland and suddenly found an immense opening in the sea. What Hanno likely witnessed was the geographic turn into the Gulf of Guinea. According to Hanno, the crew saw innumerable fires dotting the nighttime shore in this region. These fires, large and small flaring up in the darkness, might have been a form of slash-and-burn agriculture, or simply large communal fires in villages. To Hanno's crew, however, it was a mysterious and disconcerting spectacle. They anchored at an island within a bay that had a saltwater lagoon and another island inside it, and there they experienced an eerie night. They heard what they believed to be the sound of flutes, cymbals, drums, and the clamor of a crowd chanting from the mainland. The Carthaginians grew fearful at these strange noises in an unknown land. Hanno's crew advised that they leave the area, and the fleet quickly departed in the morning. After fleeing the disturbing sounds that haunted them through the night, Hanno's expedition soon encountered even more astonishing experiences. As they sailed onward, the sailors noticed that the coast itself seemed to be on fire. The terrified sailors couldn't even approach this shore due to the heat, and on one night a colossal blaze was seen raging up to the sky. By daybreak, it revealed itself as a soaring volcanic mountain. Hanno and his crew named this volcanic peak the Chariot of the Gods. This is one of the most dramatic episodes in Hanno's narrative and has allowed historians to pinpoint his likely location. Well, actually, I should say it's one of the most dramatic non-gorilla related moments, but we'll get to apes shortly. The description of a high mountain blasting a column of fire into the air very strongly suggests they saw an active volcano. The only volcano along Africa's Atlantic coast fitting that description is Mount Cameroon, standing 13,000 feet tall. Mount Cameroon, whose local name means Seat of the Gods, is known to have eruptions where lava flows reach the sea. Thus, many scholars concur that Hanno likely sailed as far as the Gulf of Guinea in Central Africa, observing Mount Cameroon's eruption with awe. This feat, if accurate, is extraordinary. It would put Hanno's journey at least 2,500 miles beyond Carthage. Turning south after the volcano incident, Hanno reached what the text calls the Horn of the South, another bay. This was likely in the vicinity of the mouth of the Gabon River. In this gulf, the explorers found an island with a lagoon and another inner island. Coming ashore, they encountered one of the most famous and puzzling discoveries of the journey, a population of hairy, savage animals, who the Greek translation called gorillae. Hanno's crew attempted to capture these creatures. The male gorillas proved too agile and ferocious, pelting the sailors with stones from high ground and escaping into the forests. However, they managed to seize 3 of the females, who were subsequently slain and skinned when they wouldn't cooperate with their abductors. Hanno took the hairy skins of these strange beings back home as tangible proof of what they had found. The account ends abruptly here, noting that provisions were running low, and Hanno and company could sail no further without risking their ability to get back home. The fleet then turned back north, effectively concluding its exploration at the very thresholds of the equatorial African coast. The tale of the gorillas has captivated readers for millennia, wondering what these hairy human-like animals could be. Since gorillas have become widely known to Western audiences, the question has been raised: did Hanno actually encounter the creatures we call gorillas? Modern science leans toward yes, but they may also have been chimpanzees. The Greek word gorillae in Hanno's report is indeed the basis for the name given to gorillas when they were scientifically classified in 1847. According to Hanno, the skins of the captured gorillae were displayed in Carthage's Temple of Tanit. They would stay there for hundreds of years, until the city's destruction in 146 BC. This implies they were something truly unusual and memorable to the Carthaginians. The creatures were described as hairy, aggressive, and human-like, which fits the description of a gorilla that a group of humans is trying to capture. There is debate whether Hanno's party encountered chimpanzees or gorillas, and given the location, both could be possible. However, the males were described as standing about as tall as a man, while the females were described as being much smaller than a man. This matches up with Western gorillas, as the males stand around 5'5", while females stand more than a foot shorter. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, are much shorter, though there is also the possibility that Hanno exaggerated the size of the creatures. However, given that the pelts were brought back, it seems unlikely that he would have been able to exaggerate too much. Notably, chimpanzees are also much more violent and warlike than gorillas, and are much more dangerous in a group than gorillas are. Some have speculated that if the crew had attacked a group of chimpanzees in this way, the chimps would have slaughtered the crew. Notably, Gorillas are generally shy and not aggressive, and the behavior seems much more chimpanzee-like. However, this may be because Hanno and his crew appear to have acted aggressively first, trying to capture the gorillas. It's unclear from the account whether the gorillas were aggressive at all before the human crew decided they wanted to bring one of them back to Carthage. We know nothing of the return trip, but it would have likely been a daunting task. Sailing along West Africa meant fighting against the prevailing trade winds and the Canary Current, which strongly pushed southward. Ancient ships with square sails and no central rudder had extreme difficulty against such conditions. Hanno's fleet of oared galleys, manned by hundreds of rowers, likely had to rely on muscle power and coastal currents to make headway. It may have taken months of slow progress, hugging the coast and waiting for favorable breezes, to claw their way back to the Moroccan settlements and ultimately home to Carthage. This achievement in navigation underscores Carthage's maritime capabilities. Their ships and sailors were robust enough to traverse enormous distances and make the return trip. Later writers were so baffled by the account that they even took to exaggerating Hanno's voyage. Notably, Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, claimed that Hanno sailed from Carthage all the way to Arabia, essentially circumnavigating Africa. While this idea has generally been dismissed, some have speculated that Pliny was working with a lost source that describes the latter portion of the journey. While early modern scholars actively fought to dismiss the story of Hanno as improbable, or even impossible, Hanno's description of the voyage matches up with real geographic features. Hanno couldn't have known the geography unless he made the journey himself, and as such historians now accept the tale to be based in reality. Notably, most potential issues with Hanno's account are explained by the fact that it was copied numerous times over the centuries. The only copies that still exist are in Greek and date from the 9th and 14th centuries respectively, with the original text being long lost. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here. Just reminding you to like, subscribe, and share this video with 2 people you know. Also, if you want to support my work further, be sure to check out my other channels, which focus on contemporary mysteries and true crime topics. In Mesopotamian history, few names evoke as much fascination as Akkad, the lost capital of the world's first empire. Around 2340 BC, Sargon of Akkad rose to power and forged a dynasty that would dominate Mesopotamia for about 150 years. The city of Akkad became the imperial capital, ruling over a united realm in the last third of the 3rd millennium BC. However, unlike cities such as Babylon or Ur, Akkad's physical location has slipped into obscurity. Despite its fame in both the ancient and modern world, archaeologists today have yet to pinpoint where this iconic city once stood. Sargon's ascent from royal cupbearer to conqueror in the 24th century BC marked a turning point for Mesopotamia. Instead of ruling a single city-state, he embarked on unprecedented foreign conquests, bringing much of the Near East under his dominion. For the first time, a Mesopotamian king wielded power over multiple peoples and far-flung lands, in effect creating the world's first empire. To govern this vast realm, Sargon established his capital at Akkad and installed Akkadian governors over the old Sumerian cities, effectively unifying the region under one administration. He is even credited with organizing a standing army of about 5,000 soldiers, the earliest known professional army in history, to maintain control of his territories. Under Sargon's rule, the Akkadian language also replaced Sumerian in official use, signaling a shift in the cultural landscape. Akkad's ascendancy also sparked a cultural and religious transformation. Sargon made Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, the patron deity of his dynasty, supplanting the old patron gods of Sumeria. His daughter Enheduanna became history's first named author. She composed a cycle of hymns that helped unite Sumerian and Akkadian religious traditions into a single overarching ideology. These hymns exalted the supremacy of Ishtar in every city, symbolically binding the empire's diverse peoples under one spiritual umbrella. Economically, the city became a hub of a far-reaching trade network, and texts hint that merchants dealt in goods from distant lands from all over the known world. The rulers also revolutionized imperial administration and advanced their writing system for their decrees and records. The very image of kingship was reimagined. Akkadian rulers were depicted with striking realism and divine symbolism, as seen in the famous lifelike bronze head of Sargon of Akkad. Notably, this bronze head is so famous that even now, over 4,000 years after his rule, this bronze likeness is still widely known as his image. Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, carried Akkad's power to its zenith and also perhaps to a breaking point. He waged expansive campaigns and also faced a massive uprising, which he crushed so completely that the people of Akkad proclaimed him a living god. Notably, Naram Sin would cultivate this description, perhaps coming to truly believe himself to be a living god. But not long after Naram Sin's reign, the empire started to buckle under the strain of managing numerous conquered peoples. The Sumerian king list records a period of chaos following his successor, Sharkali-Shari, where numerous people competed to be king. Notably, one poem from the time blames the fall of Akkad on offended gods withdrawing their favor, due to the rulers effectively naming themselves god-emperors. In reality, a number of factors, including internal strife, pressures from nomadic invaders, and possibly even a decades-long drought, likely led to the downfall. By 2150 BC, the empire was fragmented, and Mesopotamia returned to smaller competing states. Even after its political fall, this first empire's aura lived on in Mesopotamia's cultural memory. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian rulers held the Akkadian monarchs in legendary esteem, venerating them as model kings from a golden age. For centuries, scribes preserved and studied the inscriptions of Sargon and Naram Sin, and ancient statues and stelae from Akkad were coveted as heirlooms. The victory stele of Naram Sin, for instance, was taken as booty to the Elamite city of Susa long after Akkad's time, and proudly displayed there by a 12th century BC king. Even 1,500 years after Akkad's fall, its legacy was tangible. For instance, in the 6th century, Babylon's king claimed to have excavated and restored the long-ruined temple of Ishtar in Akkad. By the 19th century, the physical site of Akkad had vanished so completely that modern archaeologists could only speculate about its whereabouts. As scholars began deciphering tablets and saw frequent references to the illustrious city, it was initially believed that it would be quite easy to locate. In the early days, various ruin mounds in central Iraq were tentatively proposed as Akkad. Without solid evidence, however, these identifications remained guesswork. One theory even suggested that Akkad was simply an old name for Babylon itself, though this idea was later discarded. The quest for Akkad has homed in on the fertile plain of central Mesopotamia, between the modern cities of Baghdad and Samarra. Within this broad region, scholars have identified two likely zones where Akkad might have stood. One is near the Tigris's junction with the Diyala River, just east or northeast of present-day Baghdad, a logical crossroads of ancient trade and travel. The other is farther north, around the confluence of the Adam River with the Tigris, south of Samarra. Both locations fit clues gleaned from primary sources. An old Babylonian itinerary, for example, places Akkad on the route between Sippar, a city on the Euphrates, and Eshnunna on the Diyala. Yet the northern candidate has compelling evidence of its own. In 1821, the explorer Claudius Rich reported the discovery of a statue fragment at a site locals called El Sanam, near the town of Qadisiyah, between Samara and the Adam River. This black stone fragment turned out to be the base of an old Akkadian statue, believed to represent Raimush, Sargon's son, and originally standing about 3 meters tall. Finding such a monumental Akkadian artifact in that location hints at a major center in the vicinity, possibly the long-lost Akkad itself. The site, however, lies right on the bank of the Tigris and has been heavily eroded by the river over the centuries. This fuels speculation that the Tigris may have obliterated portions of Akkad's ruins, complicating efforts to locate them. However, others believe that this monument may have been moved to that location due to the prestige of the empire and all artifacts associated with it. The challenge of locating Akkad is compounded by both natural and modern factors. The rivers of Mesopotamia have shifted their courses dramatically over 4 millennia, often burying or erasing ancient sites. Akkad's ruins could thus be deeply buried beneath silt, or even lie beneath the water table of today's Tigris, making excavation extremely difficult at best. Additionally, the prime search area is now densely populated, and unfortunately has been subject to decades of unrest and instability. The sprawling metropolis of Baghdad and its suburbs cover much of the suspected territory, limiting where archaeological digs can be conducted. Despite all the difficulties, the allure of finding this ancient city continues to endure. Uncovering the lost city would not only solve a geographical riddle, but also greatly enrich our understanding of the empire's heartland. If archaeologists were to excavate the city, we would finally know how the people of Akkad imagined a capital fit to rule the world's first empire. In the mid-1st century AD, at the height of Rome's imperial power, a small band of Romans ventured farther into Africa than any of their known predecessors. Imagine a column of sunburnt legionaries and local guides trudging through the Sahara's endless sands, their armor shimmering under a relentless sun. They were led by a man named Septimius Flaccus, tasked with pursuing elusive raiders who had dared to harass Rome's African frontier. This expedition would carry them beyond the familiar fringes of the empire and into lands virtually unknown to Mediterranean peoples. What follows is the story of the remarkable trek that would later blur the lines between fact and legend. This is the first Roman expedition to Lake Chad, in the heart of Africa. The geopolitical backdrop of Flaccus's mission was Rome's effort to secure its North African provinces and trade routes in the decades following Emperor Augustus. By the 1st century AD, Rome controlled the fertile Mediterranean coast of Africa, including cities like Leptis Magna and Sabratha in modern Libya. These coastal cities prospered on Saharan trade. Gold, exotic animals, and ivory came north in exchange for Roman goods. However, the riches of the interior were guarded by distance, heat, and the independent peoples of the desert. Chief among these were the Garamantes, a Berber kingdom centered on the Fezzan region of the Sahara. The Garamantes controlled oases and conducted their own agriculture and trade. They were no mere barbarian nomads, despite Roman stereotypes that painted them as bandits on chariots. In fact, the Garamantes built a capital city at Garama in modern Libya and engineered underground water channels to irrigate their lands. In essence, they had a hidden civilization thriving in the desert that could facilitate trade with the wider Roman world. Yet, from Rome's perspective, they were also troublesome neighbors. Trade caravans and Roman outposts in North Africa sometimes suffered raids from nomadic groups, likely operating in or beyond Garamantian territory. These raiders may have operated with the tacit approval of the Garamantes, though this, of course, is only an educated guess by modern historians. Such disturbances threatened the flow of goods and the peace along the empire's southern border. Emperor Augustus had earlier confronted this problem through a military campaign led by Lucius Cornelius Balbus in 19 BC. Balbus penetrated deep into the Sahara with 10,000 legionaries, defeated the Garamantes, and even earned a triumph in Rome for his victories. Roman accounts claim that Balbus's men pushed beyond the Garamantes' stronghold and glimpsed a great river deep in the interior. Indeed, Roman artifacts and coins have been found as far south as Mali, supporting the notion that some soldiers or traders reached those distant lands. Balbus's foray secured a temporary peace and expanded geographical knowledge of Africa. His campaign demonstrated that the Sahara was not an insurmountable barrier and whetted Roman appetites for the wealth lying beyond. In the decades after Balbus, other Romans took up similar paths. In 41 AD, the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus led an army across the Atlas Mountains of Mauritania, observing snow-capped peaks and reaching into lands south of modern Morocco. These ventures were rare and bold, fueled by a mix of strategic concern and curiosity. By 50 AD, Rome again needed to project power southward, this time in response to renewed incursions from the desert. This set the stage for Septimius Flaccus's legendary expedition to the shores of Lake Chad, where he would see wonders beyond comprehension. The expedition of Flaccus was prompted by a specific threat. A rebellious tribe from the interior had attacked the region around Leptis Magna. Leptis Magna was a flourishing Roman city on the coast, in what is now Libya, and such raids endangered its trade networks and prosperity. Roman authorities in Africa couldn't ignore these attacks. Thus, around 50 AD, Septimius Flaccus, an official whose background remains somewhat mysterious, was commissioned to lead a retaliatory strike deep into the Sahara. Little is recorded about Flaccus himself. He's not listed as a governor or a legion's commander in other records, which has led historians to speculate significantly about his identity. He may have been a Roman from the equestrian class, or provincial officer entrusted with a desert detachment. It's also possible that perhaps Ptolemy, our main source on this expedition, garbled his name in transmission. Regardless of his rank, Flaccus clearly possessed the skill and authority to command an arduous campaign. He gathered a contingent of soldiers, likely a mix of legionaries from the African garrison and local auxiliaries familiar with desert warfare, and prepared to march south from Leptis Magna. Equipping the force for a trans-Saharan journey required careful planning, and unfortunately we don't have the full details, but historians are able to offer educated guesses. The Romans would have secured camels to carry water and supplies, since these animals were essential for traversing vast waterless distances. The early part of the route was likely known from earlier incursions, and some of the later details may have been provided by North African traders. They would have traveled from the Mediterranean coast to the first string of oases and into the Garamantes' domain. Messages may have been sent ahead to Garama, the Garamantian capital, warning its king not to obstruct Rome's punitive mission. Or perhaps no warning was given as Flaccus intended to surprise the raiders. Either way, the expedition's goal was twofold: punish the nomadic marauders and, by doing so, secure safer conditions for Roman trade. Any intelligence gathered about the lands beyond would be a welcome bonus for Rome's geographers and merchants. Flaccus led his men from the olive groves and marble villas of Leptis into the harsh Libyan interior, leaving behind the familiar world of Roman roads for uncharted wastes. Southward they trekked, likely passing settlements like Sidimus, modern Gadames, and then entering the Fezzan, the heartland of the Garamantes. Along the way, they would have seen the landscape change, coastal plains giving way to arid highlands, and then to the great sand seas of the Sahara. It was a realm of shimmering mirages by day and brilliant stars by night. The expedition probably followed caravan routes known to desert nomads, moving from one life-saving oasis to the next. Reaching Garamantian territory, Flaccus had to deal with the very people Rome once subdued under Balbus. According to the account preserved by the later geographer Ptolemy, Flaccus marched into Garamantes' territory and subdued raiders. The exact details aren't known, but it would appear that the Garamantians themselves may not have agreed to this Roman incursion initially. Perhaps a set of skirmishes took place near the oasis towns in modern Libya, a clash of Roman discipline against swift desert fighters who knew the terrain. Flaccus's troops managed to defeat, or at least disperse the raiding tribes, and thus halted the attacks on Roman lands. In doing so, he likely struck a blow to the Garamantian king's authority, or negotiated an understanding to allow his further passage. Pressing onward, Flaccus didn't turn back after chastising the raiders. He was determined to push deeper, where few Romans had gone. The expedition continued south past the Garamantes' last outposts. They traversed the rugged Tibesti Mountains, today located in modern Chad, whose dark volcanic peaks rose unexpectedly from the desert's flat expanse. Crossing these mountains was no small feat, and the terrain is difficult, cut by canyons and prone to extreme temperatures. Yet beyond Tibesti, the Romans found an even greater surprise. After roughly 3 months of arduous travel across barren sands and stony plains, Flaccus arrived at a vast lake in the midst of the savannah. Ancient reports refer to it as the Lake of the Hippopotamus and Rhinoceros, a description that vividly captures the exotic fauna the Romans encountered there. In fact, this was very likely what we know today as Lake Chad, which was then a much larger lake than in modern times. The soldiers who had trudged through dune and dust now stood on the shores of a freshwater sea teeming with life. One can imagine their awe as they beheld animals only heard of in travelers' tales. They saw massive hippos wallowing in the shallows and on the reedy banks, and the unmistakable silhouette of a 2-horned rhinoceros. Elephants might have roamed the vicinity as well, given the lake's extensive wetlands in that era. For Romans more accustomed to the tame olive groves of Italy or the dry hills of Tunisia, the sight of such creatures in their natural habitat must have been breathtaking. Flaccus and his men had effectively reached the edge of the world, as it was then known to Greco-Roman civilization. They had entered the land the Romans called Ethiopia, a broad term they used for sub-Saharan Africa and its peoples. Specifically, Ptolemy records that Flaccus journeyed into a region called Agasimba, which is described as far south of the Sahara. Agasimba's precise location is debated, but the ancient account places it near Lake Chad, implying that the Romans encountered indigenous communities there. Unfortunately, the details of any interaction between the native peoples of Lake Chad and the Roman expedition are lost to history. Ptolemy's summary gives no ethnographic descriptions, only noting that Flaccus's was the first Roman force to spend any length of time in that far southern region. It's possible the Romans made peaceful contact, trading trinkets for food and information. The lack of recorded conflict at the lake suggests that Flaccus didn't engage in major hostilities there. Instead, the expedition likely rested and refilled water skins, marveling at the fertile contrast to the desert behind them. They had achieved their outward objective. The nomadic raiders were vanquished or cowed, and an astonishing geographical discovery lay under their sandals. After reaching the Great Lake and planting the metaphorical eagle standard farther south than it had ever been, Flaccus had to bring his men safely home. The expedition retraced its path northward, crossing again the burning dunes and treacherous highlands. They would return with stories of a gigantic lake and its beasts, of strange lands rich with water and life beyond the desert. Back in Roman North Africa, the mission could be counted a success on absolutely all accounts. Flaccus had avenged the attacks on Leptis Magna and impressed upon the Garamantes the reach of Roman power. If any captives or spoils were taken, they might have been paraded in provincial towns. Unlike Balbus, however, Flaccus didn't receive a grand triumph in Rome, and indeed, his deeds are not celebrated in surviving Roman annals. This relative silence may be due to Flaccus's lower status, or simply the limited nature of the records that have survived. It's very possible there was a great work written about Flaccus's journey, but we simply don't have it, nor do we know about it. Nevertheless, his journey left a mark on imperial knowledge. Reports from the expedition likely filtered back to scholars and map makers. Within a few decades, Roman geographers had incorporated these new insights. Maps were adjusted to show a water body deep in Africa, and later writers like Ptolemy knew to call Lake Chad by its evocative nickname, the Lake of the Hippopotamus and Rhinoceros. There are strong indications that despite the lack of contemporary sources lauding him, Flaccus's exploits inspired further ventures through the Great Desert. Roman strategy in Africa often blended military aims with exploration. In 70 AD, just 20 years later, another commander, Gaius Valerius Festus, marched south with the 3rd Augustan Legion to deal with the Garamantes uprising once again. Festus is said to have followed the course of earlier explorers, pushing through the Sahara after subduing the tribes. Some accounts even credit one of these expeditions, variously attributed to Flaccus or Festus, with leaving a small garrison of Roman soldiers somewhere in the far interior. The idea that a Roman outpost might have briefly existed near the lands of Lake Chad is, of course, fascinating. However, as yet, there has been no archaeological findings to prove this one way or the other. The tale of Flaccus's march to Lake Chad straddles the line between established history and intriguing speculation. Our principal source, the 2nd century geographer Claudius Ptolemy, never witnessed these events himself. He compiled them from earlier reports, notably those of Marinus of Tyre a few decades after Flaccus. Ptolemy's Geographia distilled these travels into coordinates and brief notes, which means we are working with what amounts to a fragment of the original story. We're seeing a distillation of something that was already distilled, and which may have been further distilled from an unknown source used by Marinus. And note here that I say an unknown source used by Marinus. While Marinus is extremely influential, unfortunately none of his works survived, so we're denied the ability to cross-reference Flaccus's account with what Marinus wrote. Thus, one modern debate centers on credibility. Did Flaccus truly reach Lake Chad, or did Ptolemy or his source misinterpret the data? Many historians give credence to the journey, since the details align with geographic reality. The mention of a large lake with hippos and rhinos strongly suggests Lake Chad. No other known lake in that vicinity matches the description, and it would be an odd detail to invent. Furthermore, Ptolemy references major rivers in the area which correspond to the rivers which feed into Lake Chad. This precision suggests that Ptolemy was working off accurate sources from someone who was indeed familiar with the water systems of this large lake. While it's generally universally accepted that Flaccus did make the journey, the finer details have been questioned as well. In Flaccus's case, some have wondered whether he personally went all the way to Lake Chad, or if he sent a smaller party beyond the Tibesti Mountains, while he remained in the safer north. Because Ptolemy's account is terse, we can't be sure if Flaccus saw the lake himself or simply received reports from native guides. Roman coins dated to the 1st and 2nd centuries have been found in Chad, which is astounding at first glance. However, these findings are often isolated and could have arrived through peaceful trade or later era contacts, rather than a specific military expedition. Another point of debate involves the expedition's outcome and purpose. While clearly initiated as a punitive raid against rowdy nomads, Flaccus's journey took on exploratory dimensions, for reasons that aren't fully known. Did the Romans intend from the outset to reach Agasimba, or was that a spontaneous extension once the military objective was done? Others believe these could have perhaps been two expeditions, one to punish the raiders, and another separate one to follow up on intel learned during the initial police action in North Africa. If we are to believe the most grand version of the story, the Roman expedition to Lake Chad under Flaccus is one of the most compelling stories of ancient travel. Flaccus marched his men beyond the frontier of maps, crossed deadly deserts, and stood on the shores of Central Africa's Great Lake, all for the glory of Rome. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out my other channels, my podcast, and more by clicking the links in the description. In ancient China, political power was not just a matter of might or lineage, but a reflection of cosmic favor. Emperors rose and fell not by strength alone, but by the will of heaven. This belief was encapsulated in the mandate of heaven, a doctrine that became the cornerstone of Chinese political philosophy. According to this idea, there could only be one legitimate ruler of China at any given time, and that ruler held a sacred right to govern for as long as he retained heaven's approval. If an emperor governed justly, maintained order, and cared for the welfare of his people, heaven, known as Tian in Chinese, would bless his reign. But if a ruler became despotic or negligent, then heaven's mandate could be withdrawn as swiftly as it was granted. The concept of the mandate of heaven first emerged during the Zhou dynasty in the 11th century BC as a groundbreaking justification for dynastic change. It arose from a real political upheaval, the overthrow of the Shang dynasty by the Zhou clan. In 1046 BC, King Wu of Zhou led his forces to defeat King Dixin, the last Shang king, at the Battle of Mu. The Shang had ruled for centuries, claiming divine favor through their deity Shangdi, but by the end their court was infamous for excess and cruelty. According to Zhou accounts, King Dixin had become a tyrant, squandering state resources on debauchery and enforcing brutal punishments, while neglecting the kingdom's welfare. To a populace suffering under a corrupt ruler, the fall of the Shang seemed both inevitable and justified. Now, before I go on, I need to note that the Zhou ruled China in some capacity for about 800 years after this overthrow. That is to say, they had significant time to make sure that the official surviving historical narratives portrayed the Shang dynasty they overthrew as decadent or even degenerate in nature. Further, Confucius himself venerated the Duke of Zhou, the younger brother of King Wu, as a model sagely and political ideal for all individuals to aspire to. This endorsement by the most influential moral philosopher in Chinese history would of course pay dividends for the Zhou dynasty at the expense of the Shang's reputation. After their victory, the Zhou rulers needed to legitimize seizing power and being seen as something more than mere upstarts. To combat this, they introduced the idea of Tian, or heaven, as the supreme moral authority. Breaking from the Shang's worship of the celestial lord, the Zhou declared that heaven, a more abstract concept, had chosen them to rule in place of the fallen Shang. Thus was born the Mandate of Heaven, the claim that heaven had withdrawn its favor from the Shang due to their misrule and granted it to the virtuous Zhou. Zhou propagandists pointed to omens and disasters, strange celestial signs, floods, famines, interpreting these as signs of heaven's anger at the Shang. Natural calamities like earthquakes or famine were taken as divine messages about an emperor's virtue. Even rebellion against a reigning dynasty could now be justified as the righteous will of heaven. Importantly, the Mandate of Heaven had no fixed term and was not bound to any one royal lineage. Unlike some other cultures' ideas of eternal divine right, the Chinese mandate was conditional. It held that any person, from a noble to a commoner to a foreign horse lord, could receive heaven's blessing to become emperor, so long as he proved himself a just and able ruler. History was thus depicted as a moral continuum. Each dynasty rose with heaven's favor and fell when it lost virtue. This concept was the Zhou's most significant contribution to Chinese political thought, providing a powerful justification for regime change and setting clear moral expectations for rulers. At its heart, the Mandate of Heaven carried a profound message about merit and morality in governance. Heaven was conceived not as a personal god who arbitrarily backed kings, but as the embodiment of an impartial moral order. The emperor, honored as the Son of Heaven, was believed to rule Tianxia, all under heaven, on heaven's behalf. This meant that a ruler's legitimacy depended on his virtue and ability to maintain harmony in the realm. Good governance, characterized by justice, prosperity, and stability, was seen as evidence that an emperor truly held heaven's mandate. Conversely, signs of governmental failure or moral decay suggested that the cosmic balance had turned against the ruler. Chinese historians made this principle explicit in their records. They noted that when dynasties were about to fall, unusual natural disasters and omens often struck, clear signs that heaven was displeased with the reigning king. Thus, droughts or floods weren't random misfortunes, but heavenly warning shots. If the emperor ignored such warnings and the kingdom slipped further into disorder, it was expected that heaven would revoke its mandate and allow someone else to take charge. This philosophy had a dual effect. It reinforced imperial authority while also limiting it. On one hand, the doctrine reassured people that the sitting emperor was the rightful, divinely endorsed ruler, and he was on the throne only because heaven willed it so. On the other hand, it implicitly granted the populace and ambitious would-be leaders the right to depose a wicked or inept ruler. The Mandate of Heaven thus included a de facto right of rebellion, which, given the historical context of the shift from the Shang to the Zhou, this makes sense. If a dynasty fell, that very fact was interpreted as proof that it deserved to fall. The Confucian philosopher Mencius articulated this idea. The people's welfare is paramount, and a ruler who causes suffering loses heaven's sanction. In his view, overthrowing such a tyrant wasn't treason, but a righteous duty. Put another way, a successful rebellion was itself proof that heaven had sided with the uprising, since only with heaven's favor could the revolutionaries triumph in the end. This notion served as a profound check on absolutism. It established an ancient moral contract between the ruler and the ruled that tethered political power to ethical behavior, at least theoretically. Once established, the Mandate of Heaven became the lens through which the Chinese interpreted their history. Dynasties, they believed, rose and fell in an ongoing dynastic cycle guided by heaven's mandate. A new dynasty typically began with vigor and virtue, bringing peace and prosperity. Over time, complacency or corruption might set in. The taxes would rise too high, officials would grow decadent, and the court would become mired in some combination of extreme detached luxury and petty infighting. Eventually, disasters and unrest would spread, signaling that the dynasty had lost heaven's favor. Finally, a challenger would emerge, perhaps a disaffected general or a peasant leader, to overthrow the discredited regime and found a new dynasty, claiming heaven's blessing anew. This cycle repeated across the centuries, and the Chinese people came to view it as the natural order of things. History provides vivid examples of this pattern. After the long reign of the Zhou kings, China descended into the Warring States period from 475 to 221 BC as rival lords fought for supremacy. Out of this chaos, the state of Qin triumphed and unified China in 221 BC, ending centuries of division. King Zheng of Qin crowned himself the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, but the Qin dynasty's rule, though powerful, proved brutally harsh. Forced labor for grand projects and the emperor's extremely draconian laws bred widespread resentment. After all, the idea of taking valuable craftsmen away from their jobs to build a giant mausoleum filled with terracotta warriors may not be seen as the most prudent usage of resources. This is what we call speedrunning the loss of the mandate of heaven. The Qin's unyielding approach quickly backfired. After the first emperor died, rebellion erupted throughout the land. Everyone from oppressed peasants to disgruntled nobles rose up against the Qin, with all parties citing the dynasty's cruelty and misrule as evidence that it lacked heaven's favor. This is evidence that the mandate of heaven wasn't simply a philosophical idea that people spoke about. They actually acted on it as a rallying cry. Within a few years, the Qin government had crumbled. By 202 BC, Liu Bang, a former peasant-turned-general, defeated his rivals and founded the Han dynasty, declaring that heaven's mandate had passed to him and his heirs. Liu Bang's humble origins reinforced the notion that merit and virtue, not noble birth, were the true qualifications for rulership under heaven. The Han dynasty, from 206 BC to 220 AD, went on to preside over one of China's golden ages, and it fully embraced the mandate of heaven. Han emperors performed elaborate rituals to honor heaven and earth, and in times of natural disaster or social unrest, they took such events as prompts to correct their policies. Yet, as anyone who has ever played a Dynasty Warriors game knows, the Han too eventually succumbed to the dynastic cycle, with the Jin Empire eventually coming out triumphant. So it went, dynasty after dynasty. The Tang dynasty, running from 618 to 907 for example, was founded after the collapse of the short-lived Sui, which had overextended itself with costly conflicts and public works. When famine and rebellion ended the Sui, the victorious Tang rulers claimed the mandate and ushered in an era of prosperity often called a Golden Age. Likewise, in the 14th century, the Mongol-born Yuan dynasty was racked by floods, plagues, and peasant rebellions. These were calamities taken as signs that the Mongols had lost heaven's favor. Seizing the moment, a rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang led the uprising that toppled the Mongol rulers. In 1368, he declared himself emperor and founded the Ming dynasty, proclaiming that heaven had turned back to native Chinese rule. He proclaimed that the Mongols' misrule had cost them heaven's mandate. Even dynasties founded by outsiders continued to invoke the mandate. The Qing dynasty, from 1644 to 1912, was established by Manchu conquerors from the frigid northeast. The Qing rulers claimed that it was peasant rebels, notably Li Zicheng, who brought down the Ming dynasty, not the Manchus themselves. By defeating those rebels and reuniting the country, the Manchus argued, They had earned heaven's mandate by rescuing China from chaos. Like their predecessors, Qing emperors also regarded natural disasters during their reign as warnings from heaven to reflect on their governance and make amends. Nevertheless, by the 19th century, the Qing regime was plagued by corruption, foreign pressures, and massive uprisings. These were troubles many saw as proof that the dynasty had lost its virtue, and with it, the mandate of heaven. Ultimately, the Qing fell in the early 20th century amid revolution, and with its fall, the Chinese imperial era came to an end. For over 2 millennia, the mandate of heaven was the bedrock of Chinese political culture and the lens through which history was understood. It instilled the idea that legitimacy came from ethical governance and that no dynasty was irreplaceable. Each new dynasty portrayed the previous ruler's downfall as a moral failure and its own rise as the restoration of righteous order. Unlike the European notion of the divine right of kings, which granted kings unconditional sanction by God, the mandate of heaven set a high bar. A Chinese emperor's right to rule was conditional upon just governance and could be revoked if he became a tyrant. This principle lent Chinese history a cyclical rhythm, and even the mightiest dynasty could fall if it grew decadent, and even a peasant could rise as emperor if he earned heaven's favor. But this begs the question, was this well-meaning principle actually a recipe for instability? This topic remains hotly contested amongst scholars until this day, with no clear consensus emerging as yet. When we think of the first ruler of a unified Egypt, we often invoke the name Menes, the pharaoh who, around 3100 BC, united Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. In later Egyptian tradition, Menes is celebrated as the founding monarch of the first dynasty. Modern scholars generally identify Menes with the historical king Narmer. Narmer's victory palette shows him wearing both the white and red crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing unification. By all accounts, Menes was the pioneer of Egyptian kingship as we know it. However, despite being referred to as a pharaoh in modern sources, he would have been unfamiliar with the term. The word pharaoh, derived from an Egyptian word meaning great house, was not a title for the king in his time. Early Egyptian kings called themselves the Egyptian equivalent of king of Upper and Lower Egypt. The word that would develop into pharaoh at that time referred to the royal palace, not a person. It would be much more than 1,000 years after Menes before an Egyptian ruler would be addressed as pharaoh. Further, it may have been as much as 2,000 years later before a pharaoh was referred to as such in the exact way we do so today. The change came in the New Kingdom, running from the 16th to 11th centuries BC. Scholars suggest that Thutmose III, who ruled from 1479 to 1425 BC, may have been one of the first, if not the first, pharaohs to be referred to this way. However, from the context and evidence we have, it still remains unclear at this point if this was directly referring to him, or to the actual institution of Egyptian kingship. However, even if it wasn't a direct reference to Thutmose, it was reflecting a much greater reverence for the institution of the divine king. One reason that the term started coming into usage around this time is the increasing sanctity of the monarch's name. Egyptians held the king to be a living god, and over time it became somewhat taboo to speak the king's personal name casually. Referring to the sovereign indirectly as Pharaoh, Great House, was a respectful alternative, much like saying the crown instead of naming a king or queen. It also spoke to the institution of kingship as something greater than just one individual, again much like the term the crown. This practice echoed an old cultural attitude. For example, certain gods' names were not spoken aloud in ritual, and similarly, the god king's name was treated with reverence. By the reign of Akhenaten, Pharaoh was commonly used to mean the king in written records. It appears in letters and inscriptions as a stand-in for the ruler, indicating that the usage was well established by that time. From then on, Pharaoh effectively became a title of the monarch. Notably, for several centuries this title was used on its own. Egyptian texts would just say, Pharaoh did something, without adding a personal name. Records don't describe Akhenaten as Pharaoh Akhenaten, but rather as Pharaoh or Akhenaten. The first pharaoh definitively referred to with the title followed by his name was Pharaoh Siamun, a ruler who reigned from 986 to 967 BC. That said, whether he was the first remains up for debate. He may simply be the first ruler we have definitive evidence of being referred to this way in official writings. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, be sure to mention any historical mysteries or controversies you'd like to see covered in the comments below. Now let's get back to business. Imagine the scorching sun over Saqqara, Egypt's vast city of the dead, where archaeologists brush away golden sand in search of a legend. They're hunting for the tomb of Imhotep, a man who lived over 4,600 years ago, yet whose genius still looms large in history. Imhotep wasn't a pharaoh, but his name echoes through time as priest, architect, physician, and later as a god of healing. Strangely, for all his renown, nobody today knows where this brilliant figure's final resting place lies. His tomb remains one of Egypt's most interesting unsolved mysteries, one that has now eluded scholars from numerous civilizations for millennia. During the 27th century BC, at the dawn of Egypt's third dynasty, Imhotep rose from the ranks of commoners to become one of the most trusted advisors of Djoser. He bore lofty titles according to an inscription on Djoser's own statue base, a fact that perhaps makes him the first non-monarch recorded in history. These titles tell us that Imhotep was Djoser's chief minister, the high priest of the sun god's temple, and the kingdom's lead architect and builder. Such honors on a king's statue were unprecedented for someone not of royal blood, suggesting Imhotep was regarded almost as a member of the royal family. In fact, this has led some scholars to believe that he must be a relative of Djoser, perhaps his brother, though this is highly controversial. Imhotep's name literally means, "he who comes in peace," and he certainly made his mark peacefully through construction and general wisdom. He's most famous as the master architect behind Pharaoh Djoser's tomb, the step pyramid at Saqqara, which was the first pyramid ever built in Egypt. Prior to Imhotep, Egyptian tombs for royalty were flat-roof structures made of mud brick called mastabas. Imhotep's breakthrough was to use stone as a building material on a massive scale. Around 2600 BC, he pioneered stacking mastabas in diminishing size, creating a six-tiered pyramid that soared roughly 200 feet high. By constructing Djoser's pyramid complex in limestone, Imhotep revolutionized Egyptian architecture. He effectively turned the pharaoh's burial site into an eternal palace of stone, ensuring King Djoser would be remembered as a god on earth. Notably, in a sense, this worked, because Djoser's name is still widely known today, even by those with only a passing interest in Egyptology. Imhotep lived a long life, apparently surviving Djoser and serving subsequent kings. His name even appears in the unfinished pyramid complex of Djoser's successor, Sekhemkhet, and records suggest Imhotep died in the reign of King Huni, the last ruler of the Third Dynasty. Notably, in modern times, Imhotep has attracted most of his attention for his architectural work, while to ancient Egyptians his status as a healer was of even greater renown. Interestingly, he's believed to be the first person in recorded history to record numerous diagnoses and the treatments for them. In short, Imhotep was a universal genius of the Old Kingdom: architect, engineer, priest, physician, and sage all in one. Imhotep's legacy didn't end with his death. In fact, it only grew. For the next 2 millennia, Egyptians revered Imhotep's memory so deeply that he was eventually deified. By the New Kingdom period, scribes worshipped Imhotep as the patron of wisdom. They saw in him the embodiment of intellect and learning. In the late period, from the 7th to 4th centuries BC, Imhotep's cult really blossomed. He was officially recognized as a god of medicine and healing. Temples were dedicated to Imhotep, priests served in his name, and people offered prayers for cures to illness. The Greeks who later occupied Egypt were so impressed by Imhotep's healing reputation that they linked him to Asclepius, their own god of medicine. Evidence of this posthumous fame is found throughout Egyptian history. In the Ptolemaic era, after Greek conquest, a famous inscription known as the Famine Stela imagines King Djoser appealing to Imhotep to save Egypt from a 7-year drought. Ironically, by this time, Imhotep's reputation had far exceeded that of his patron, as well as virtually every other ruler of Egypt. The Greek rulers of Egypt continued to build and patronize temples to Imhotep. It's unclear whether they recognized him as a real man who once lived, or a divine figure who walked the earth to assist the ancient Egyptians. In essence, Imhotep the man became Imhotep the myth, one of the very few non-royals in Egyptian history to be elevated to godhood. This extraordinary status is a testament to the impact he had on the Egyptian imagination. Considering Imhotep's towering reputation, one might expect his tomb would be a prominent monument at Saqqara. Ironically, however, Imhotep's tomb has never been found. For well over 150 years, Egyptologists have scoured the Saqqara necropolis and beyond, but the location of Imhotep's burial remains elusive. This missing tomb is more than just an archaeological curiosity. It's potentially a historical goldmine. If discovered intact, Imhotep's tomb could reveal priceless information about his life, his family, and his era. Personal inscriptions or artifacts from his burial would shed light on the man behind the legend, filling gaps in our understanding of Egypt's third dynasty. In other words, finding Imhotep's tomb could greatly enhance our knowledge of this important figure's life and career. It would also serve to peel back some of the layers of legend that were later overlaid on top of the historic individual. Scholars generally agree he was laid to rest somewhere in the vast royal cemeteries of Memphis, likely at Saqqara. Two main theories have emerged about the tomb's location. Some experts argue that because Imhotep was so closely connected to Djoser, he could have been interred in or near Djoser's own monumental enclosure. Imhotep is specifically mentioned by name on engravings at the site, though these talk about his accomplishments and don't specifically mention him being buried there. Djoser's complex was sacred ground, and later legends even suggest Imhotep might be hidden under or around the step pyramid itself. Notably, large sections of Djoser's complex remain unexcavated, leaving room for hope that Imhotep's tomb could lie concealed in those unexplored zones. Others believe Imhotep was given a grand tomb in the general cemetery for high officials of his time. North Saqqara is dotted with massive mastaba tombs of 3rd Dynasty nobles, some as big as small pyramids. Imhotep's resting place could be one of these large mud brick mastabas, or beneath one, awaiting identification. In fact, British archaeologist Walter Emery in the 1960s became convinced that a particular tomb, called 3518, in North Saqqara, was Imhotep's final resting place. This tomb had an unusually complex layout of chambers for cult rituals, and clay ceilings bearing King Djoser's name, which hints that someone of very high status was buried there. But more on Emery's search for Imhotep in a moment, since he did discover something else magnificent that is a potential clue to the location of the tomb. Some other scholars believe that Imhotep's tomb might have been discovered at some point in the past, but not recognized due to heavy damage or missing inscriptions. In short, under this theory, the famous tomb could be hidden in plain sight, an unassuming ruin already dug up but never linked to Imhotep because time erased its markers. Others believe that there's the potential that he wasn't buried in Saqqara at all, given that little is known about his early life. The quest to find Imhotep's tomb has led archaeologists down fascinating paths, sparking discoveries even when the prize itself stays out of reach. A dramatic chapter of this search began in the 1930s with Walter Emery, a renowned Egyptologist who dedicated years to hunting Imhotep at Saqqara. Emery had noticed a curious concentration of large ceramic jars and broken ibis bird mummies on the desert surface in part of North Saqqara. These ibises were sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom, a deity closely associated with Imhotep. The jars dated to the late period, many centuries after Imhotep's time, suggesting they were left by pilgrims visiting what they believed was Imhotep's burial site. Emery theorized that later devotees trekked to Imhotep's tomb to offer mummified ibises in his honor, leaving behind heaps of pottery. If his theory was correct, the tomb of Imhotep should lie nearby. Armed with this clue, Emery began large-scale excavations at North Saqqara in the 1960s. What he uncovered was astonishing, though not in the way he expected. Below the sand, Emery's team found a maze of underground catacombs full of animal mummies, a secret cemetery of ancient sacred creatures. There were tunnels filled wall to wall with ibis mummies in jars, others with hawks and falcons, and even areas for baboons and bulls. This turned out to be the sacred animal necropolis, an enormous religious complex from about 2,300 years ago, where people buried animals as offerings to the gods. Emery had stumbled on one of the most important late-period sites in Egypt. The discovery was a sensational find in its own right, shedding light on how ancient pilgrims worshipped Imhotep and Thoth with animal offerings. But amid all these mummies, Imhotep's personal tomb was still missing. Emery did identify the aforementioned mastaba as a strong candidate for Imhotep, though admittedly he couldn't prove it himself. His excavations there revealed those cult rooms and Djoser-inscribed ceilings, raising his hopes. Yet, frustratingly, no definitive proof emerged, and it's been suggested that the reason the site has so much related to Imhotep's life is because it was a devotional site rather than a tomb. It's necessary to keep in mind that the people worshipping Imhotep at this time were about 2,300 years removed from the life of the man himself. To put things in perspective, we're now about 2,300 years removed from the lives of those Imhotep worshippers. In 1970, as Emery continued digging in hopes of that breakthrough, he suffered a stroke at the site. He passed away in Cairo a few days later, ending his quest without the ultimate success he had sought. Emery's lifetime search for Imhotep had instead unlocked a different treasure, the vast animal cult complex, but the man he sought remained in the shadows. In the decades after Emery, various Egyptologists have revisited the search with fresh eyes and new technology. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified some intriguing anomalies under the sands of North Saqqara. There are hints of large rectangular structures that could be candidates for Imhotep's tomb. These buried structures, however, remain unexcavated, essentially X marks on a map awaiting future exploration. Thousands of years ago, Imhotep helped immortalize King Djoser by building a house of stone for his spirit. Yet Imhotep's own immortality has taken a different form. Not a known tomb or mummy, but a legacy of legend and a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The tale of Imhotep's tomb is a reminder of how much of the ancient past still remains hidden. The Saqqara bird is a small, carved wooden object that has captivated historians and aviation enthusiasts alike for over a century. Discovered in 1898 during the excavation of a tomb at Saqqara, this intriguing artifact dates back over 2 millennia to around 200 BC. It resembles a stylized bird, with outstretched wings measuring about 7 centimeters across and a lightweight body weighing less than 1/10 of a pound. Crafted from sturdy sycamore wood and originally mounted on a rod, the figurine immediately stood out as a curious find. At first glance, it seems like a simple bird carving, but its unusually plane-like form has puzzled and inspired speculation ever since. In form, it resembles a bird of prey. The carving is sleek and almost aerodynamic, with flat, horizontal wings as if poised in glide. The head is carved with a hooked beak, reminiscent of a falcon, a creature sacred to the ancient Egyptians. The tail is broad and level, though the artifact notably lacks legs or painted detail. Its craftsmanship is simple yet well-proportioned, suggesting the maker had a good sense of balance. Today, this little wooden bird is displayed in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, where its plane-like silhouette continues to fascinate visitors. Visitors can find it on the museum's upper floor among other animal figurines, yet this particular piece stands out as a mystery of its own. Without inscriptions or records, archaeologists have had to speculate on why this miniature bird was made. One idea is that it served a ceremonial or symbolic function. Falcons were sacred in Egypt, representing sky gods like Horus and Ra, so a falcon-shaped figure could have been a ritual object or charm for protection. Another possibility is that it was a toy for a child of the elite. Under this theory, some have even likened it to a form that might glide when thrown, given that ancient Egyptians used such hunting tools for birds. Others suggest it functioned as a weather vane, or was mounted on the front of a sacred boat during religious festivals. Any of these uses might fit its context in the Ptolemaic period, but without definitive evidence, they remain educated guesses. The Saqqara bird's fame grew largely due to a controversial idea that it was more than a toy or ritual figurine, that it was actually a model of an ancient Egyptian flying machine. This bold theory took off in the 1960s, when Khalil Massia, an Egyptian physician, suggested the wooden bird was a proof-of-concept glider. He pointed to its wing shape, arguing it could generate lift. The flat top of the tail, he believed, once held a tail stabilizer that later broke off. To test this, Massia built an enlarged replica with an added tail fin, and according to his reports, the model did glide when launched. This claim was met with some skepticism by the aviation community. Unfortunately, others tried to recreate his supposed experiment, and no one else could replicate the results. Aeronautical engineers who analyzed the artifact have noted practical problems. It's too heavy and unbalanced to glide effectively, especially since it lacks a tail rudder for stability. The academic community also greeted this ancient airplane theory with skepticism as well. No depictions or writings from Egypt hint at any attempt to fly, and a lone wooden model isn't proof of lost technology. All evidence to date suggests the artifact was never meant to be a serious flying device, but rather a static object with symbolic or practical purpose. Some fringe theorists even tied the Saqqara bird to ancient astronaut myths of extraterrestrial influence. Under this theory, the bird may not be proof that Egyptians themselves had the technology to fly, but may have been their attempt to explain what they saw. As mentioned, the sakura bird dates to around 200 BC in Ptolemaic Egypt. By this period, Egypt was fully enmeshed in the Hellenistic Mediterranean world. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, had become the intellectual and commercial hub of the region, with the Great Library fostering rapid exchange of ideas and technologies. Had there been genuine evidence of flying machines or extraterrestrial visitors, Greek and Egyptian scholars would surely have recorded it in writings. This was a period where this knowledge would have circulated across Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The complete absence of such accounts in papyri, inscriptions, or classical literature makes the ancient astronaut explanation both unnecessary and unsupported. Despite decades of study, the sakura bird still remains an Egyptian enigma. That said, all evidence suggests that it was a much more grounded object than some would like to believe. Around 600 BC, an unusual sight unfolded on Egypt's Red Sea coast. A squadron of Phoenician ships preparing to sail into the unknown, commissioned by the Pharaoh himself. Their mission was unbelievable, to keep going south and west, attempting to do what no one in their world had done before: circumnavigate Africa and successfully return home. If the story is true, it means that 2 millennia before the Age of Discovery, ancient mariners may have already achieved what later explorers heralded as a groundbreaking feat. Notably, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded the account, and even he found it hard to believe. Yet, intriguingly, one detail the Phoenician sailors reported: something about the position of the sun during their journey, hints that the story might just be true. Modern historians are now left to wonder whether these ancient Phoenicians, sailing for Egypt, truly accomplished the impossible, or whether this is a legend that has been embellished over time. Necho II, who ruled from 610 to 595, was an ambitious pharaoh of Egypt's 26th dynasty. His kingdom, recently free from Assyrian domination, was eager to reclaim its power on the world stage. Necho fought major conflicts in the Near East against rising powers like Babylonia, but after defeats he shifted focus to bold infrastructure and maritime projects. One grand endeavor was his attempt to dig a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, essentially a forerunner of the Suez Canal. Though that canal was never completed, both due to cost and the risk of his enemies using it as well, it shows Necho's vision of Egypt as a trading and naval power. While earlier pharaohs sent ships to trade with the land of Punt on Africa's eastern coast, no recorded Egyptian voyage had ever pushed beyond those known waters into the open ocean. Necho took unprecedented steps to build up a navy, but despite being a visionary, he realized that naval tradition is built up over generations, not over the course of a few years. Luckily for him, the Egyptians were the immediate neighbors of the greatest mariners in the ancient world. Necho recruited veteran mariners from Phoenicia to man his fleets on the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts. Notably, Egypt and the Phoenician city-states also shared a common rival in Babylon, which made them natural partners in exploration and enterprise. In this context, Necho set in motion an extraordinary expedition to answer a daring question. Could sailors depart Egypt, sail south and west, and come back around Africa to the Nile? Herodotus, writing about 150 years after Necho's reign, provides the principal account of this voyage, and he likely heard the tale from Egyptian priests. Herodotus relates that Necho's hired Phoenician sailors set out from Egypt's Red Sea coast and headed south, hugging the coast as they navigated into unknown waters. They took nearly 3 years to return, sailing in stages and coming ashore each autumn to sow grain and replenish their food before continuing onward. In the end, the crew passed westward through the Pillars of Heracles, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, and sailed back into the Nile Delta. According to Herodotus, they became the first to prove that Africa was surrounded by sea, rather than linked to Asia, as commonly believed. The sailors brought back one astonishing report. At one point in the far south, the sun appeared to the north of them, to the right of their ship, as they sailed west. Interestingly, this detail, which is now the best evidence in favor of the historicity of this event, was seen in a very different light by Herodotus. He found that he couldn't believe this detail, yet it's precisely what would happen to observers voyaging below the equator, lending some credence to the story. Apart from Herodotus's narrative, no contemporary record confirms the voyage. Many later writers in antiquity were skeptical that such a circumnavigation ever occurred. By the Roman era, for example, geographers like Ptolemy still argued that Africa's southern oceans were landlocked. This is a sign that if the Phoenicians did sail around Africa, their feat was not widely believed. Not long after Necho's time, the Carthaginian explorer Hanno voyaged down the African west coast, though his crew went beyond the Gulf of Guinea before turning back. Unlike the voyage sponsored by Necho, Hanno the Navigator, as he's known to history, wrote a first-person account of his journey, which survives till this day in a Greek translation. Herodotus also tells of a Persian who was ordered by Xerxes to sail from the Atlantic around Africa, though this journey is much more speculative than the other expeditions. In modern times, historians continue to debate whether this Egyptian-sponsored Phoenician circumnavigation really happened. Many consider Herodotus's report plausible, noting that the Phoenicians retained by Necho certainly had the skills and ships to attempt it. The reported 3-year duration, and that extraordinary sun on the right observation, align with what we now know would occur on a southward journey around Africa. Ancient vessels could ride seasonal winds and currents to slowly make their way around the Cape, and the Phoenicians were adept at long-distance seafaring. On the other hand, some scholars remain skeptical. They emphasize the lack of corroborating evidence and question why Necho would fund a costly voyage of discovery with no obvious immediate payoff. However, historians have also observed that Necho was the sort of visionary ruler who tried to build the Suez Canal more than 2 millennia before it was actually constructed. He may have imagined that this voyage would open up new trade routes that would have brought untold riches to Egypt. Notably, the Egyptians traded heavily with the land of Punt, in what is now Somalia, and may have seen this ability to navigate around Africa as a means to cut them out. Further, when he ordered the voyage, he of course had no idea how long it would take. While the Mediterranean and Red Sea portion of the trip would have been known, the rest was essentially guesswork, and it wasn't clear that they wouldn't just hit land going south. Surprisingly, the voyage has actually been tested in modern times. From 2008 to 2010, explorer Philip Beale and a team sailed a replica 6th century Phoenician ship around Africa, duplicating the route described by Herodotus. This voyage that took them about 2 years roughly mirrored the ancient timeline, when accounting for the fact they didn't drop anchor to farm new supplies. This experiment proved that a ship from Necho's era could theoretically manage the voyage. While it can't confirm the story directly, it lends circumstantial credibility by showing the feat was technically feasible. But this circumstantial evidence needs to be taken into account with that tidbit about the sun that Herodotus found impossible. In 600 BC, no Near Eastern or Mediterranean society had worked out the concept of an equator where the sun could appear in the northern sky. That detail in Herodotus, dismissed by him as unbelievable, makes sense precisely because it would have astonished sailors who lacked any prior theoretical expectation. Adding even more credibility to the account, Herodotus noted that this event occurred at the furthest southern point. The quote-unquote unusual position of the sun would only have become apparent the further south the sailors went. In short, this is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that the voyagers likely made it at least as far as the Cape of Good Hope, since they couldn't have known this fact otherwise. This, of course, doesn't definitively prove that they completed the circumnavigation from that point onwards. However, if they didn't complete the circumnavigation, it begs the question why the ancient voyage took roughly the same time as the modern reenactment. Whether Pharaoh Necho's African circumnavigation happened or not, the legend has secured a place in the history of exploration. If the voyage was real, it stands as one of humanity's great maritime achievements. It would push back the first known journey around the whole African continent by 2 millennia. It also means the initial credit for pioneering the Cape route belongs not to the Portuguese explorers of the 15th century, but to a band of Phoenician sailors under an Egyptian king. Even if the story was exaggerated or apocryphal, it may have inspired the well-documented epic voyage of Hanno the Navigator about a century later. It may also explain why Hanno's first-hand account of that voyage was secretive in relation to certain details. Perhaps the Carthaginians believed that the Egyptians, with the help of their Phoenician forebearers, may still be interested in the route around Africa. While I previously discussed circumstantial evidence, there's still the potential for definitive proof that the expedition was factual to be found. Herodotus doesn't specify how many ships took part in the voyage, though he does mention that sailors went out in ships, plural. Because of this omission, modern historians can only speculate on how many ships might have been involved. Most tend to assume it was a small expedition of a handful of ships at most. This estimate is based on practical concerns, as a small fleet would have been easier to supply and easier to maneuver along unknown coastlines. Definitive proof of Necho's Phoenician circumnavigation would need artifacts that unambiguously connect 6th century BC Phoenicians to coastlines far beyond the Red Sea and Mediterranean. The strongest candidate would be a Phoenician shipwreck found off southern Africa or on the Atlantic coast. This, of course, would be a very unlikely find, given the passage of time, and the fact that we don't even know if any of the ships were lost on the voyage. A second line of evidence would be the coastal landing sites. According to Herodotus, the Phoenicians set up temporary communities to farm and resupply. Perhaps the best possible evidence would be an out-of-place Phoenician inscription located somewhere in southern or western Africa. Phoenician sailors occasionally left behind graffiti or other inscriptions, and such an inscription, carved into an immovable object and dated from around that time, would be irrefutable evidence. Whether Necho's expedition occurred remains one of ancient history's greatest unsolved mysteries. While it can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the circumstantial evidence suggests that on a balance of probabilities, the Phoenician crew likely at least made it to the Cape of Good Hope. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like, subscribe, and share this video with 2 people you know. Also, after you finish up here, don't forget to check out my channel for more historical mysteries. I also have 2 other channels which focus on contemporary mysteries and true crime, respectively, if you want to switch things up a bit. Queen Nefertiti remains one of ancient Egypt's most iconic and mysterious figures. Over 3,300 years ago, she ruled alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten during the 18th dynasty, an era of great opulence and religious upheaval. Her name, which means the beautiful one has come, is perhaps fitting. A famous painted bust discovered in 1912 immortalized her striking features and cemented her status as a global symbol of beauty and power millennia after her death. Historically, though, Nefertiti wasn't only celebrated for her looks. She was the great royal wife of Akhenaten and played a pivotal role in a revolutionary experiment in monotheism. Together, The royal couple upended centuries of tradition by elevating the sun disk, Aten, as the sole god, dismantling the old worship of Amun and other deities. Nefertiti has become particularly fascinating as she's depicted in contemporary artwork participating in rituals and smiting enemies, scenes typically reserved for pharaohs. Some scholars believe she wielded power in her own right, alongside Akhenaten, and may have even ruled independently for a brief period after his death. In fact, famed Egyptologist Zahi Hawass and others suggest Nefertiti assumed a pharaoh's title during the turbulent transition following Akhenaten's reign. This theory, while not universally accepted, demonstrates Nefertiti's unique status in this royal system. By the time young Tutankhamun took the throne, Nefertiti had vanished from the record. How and when she perished remains unknown, and her tomb has likely never been found. Around the 12th to 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti seemingly fades from history. Records of her death are non-existent, and contemporaries left no clear indication of where she was buried. The royal family at that time was based in the new capital Akhetaten, modern Amarna, where Akhenaten built a grand city and a royal tomb in the desert cliffs. It's possible Nefertiti was meant to be interred at Amarna, but archaeologists have no evidence of her burial in the Amarna royal tomb. In later years, her son-in-law, King Tut, moved the court back to Thebes, and the Aten worship era was declared heresy. Subsequent pharaohs attempted to erase the entire Aten episode from history. Statues were smashed, and names and images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were chiseled out, and the heretic queen was virtually wiped from the official record. This systematic erasure was so effective that Nefertiti's legacy lay in obscurity until modern archaeology rediscovered traces of her life. But it also means clues to her death and burial were deliberately obscured. While the mummies of many 18th dynasty royals have been identified, Nefertiti's remains have never been conclusively found. In recent years, one leading hypothesis captured worldwide attention: the idea that Nefertiti's tomb might be hidden within or directly adjacent to King Tut's tomb. This theory was most prominently championed by British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves. In 2015, Reeves announced that high-resolution laser scans of the tomb walls revealed something fascinating. There were subtle fissures and outlines, suggesting two sealed doorways behind the plastered and painted surfaces. One of these hidden doorways, he proposed, could lead to an unexplored storage chamber, and the other could be the entrance to Nefertiti's lost burial chamber. Reeves pointed out that Tut's tomb is unusually small for a pharaoh and appears to have a layout suitable for a queen's burial. This implied the young king may have been interred in an antechamber of an existing tomb originally made for Nefertiti. He also noted peculiarities in the tomb's artwork. The painted figures on the north wall depict his successor performing funerary rites. He suggested they seemed to have been altered from earlier depictions of the pharaoh performing those rites for his predecessor. In other words, Reeves argued that the scene was initially meant to show Tut burying Nefertiti, and only later was it modified to show the next pharaoh burying Tut. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities took Reeves's theory seriously enough to authorize a series of investigations. In 2015 and 2016, teams conducted ground-penetrating radar scans inside Tut's tomb to detect voids or passages behind the walls. An initial scan by a Japanese specialist appeared to support the existence of hidden cavities. However, a follow-up scan funded by National Geographic was negative, finding no clear anomalies. To resolve the conflicting results, a third, more comprehensive radar survey was conducted in 2017 and 2018 by independent experts. In the words of one report, the high-confidence conclusion was that no hidden chambers adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb, exist. These findings tempered the excitement, and many archaeologists grew skeptical that Nefertiti lies behind Tut's painted walls. Interestingly, the story didn't end there. In 2020, another twist emerged when a former Egyptian antiquities minister led a high-tech radar survey of the broader area around the tomb. This team detected what appeared to be an unknown corridor and a large chamber a few meters north of the tomb. The discovery was leaked, and it was suggested that there may be a hidden 32-foot wide chamber. As of yet, that subsurface anomaly hasn't been excavated or confirmed to be a tomb, so it remains an intriguing possibility. Meanwhile, Reeves added new evidence to his theory in 2022 by identifying previously overlooked hieroglyphic traces on Tutankhamun's tomb paintings. He claimed that inscriptions naming King Tut were painted over earlier ones that named Nefertiti, implying the space originally belonged to her. The enduring mystery of Nefertiti's tomb has given rise to a range of speculative theories, some more plausible than others. One persistent idea is that Nefertiti was buried at Amarna and later moved. If she died during Akhenaten's reign, she might have originally been interred in the Amarna royal tomb, along with her daughter Meketaten, who died young and was definitely buried there. When Tut abandoned Amarna, loyalists could have taken Nefertiti's remains out and reburied her quietly in Thebes to protect her from desecration. In this scenario, her tomb in Amarna may have been destroyed or left empty. Supporting this, archaeologists at Amarna found fragments of royal coffins and equipment that hint some mummies were relocated. However, no inscription explicitly naming Nefertiti has surfaced there, and so this theory remains circumstantial. Another theory suggests that Nefertiti might have a tomb in the Valley of the Queens, or another part of the Theban hills. As the principal wife of a pharaoh, she could have been buried in a separate royal wife's tomb, rather than the main Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Queens, where queens of later dynasties were buried, has been explored, but many tombs there were heavily looted. Meanwhile, Zahi Hawass has been actively pursuing a different angle in an attempt to crack this case. Hawass has for years led a project re-examining unidentified mummies from the late 18th dynasty using modern DNA analysis. In particular, two mummified women from tomb KV-21 have drawn attention. Located in the Valley of the Kings, KV-21 contained two female bodies, designated KV-21A and KV-21B, that were poorly preserved. Preliminary DNA tests a decade ago hinted that KV-21A might be the mother of the two infant daughters of Tutankhamun found in his tomb. This suggested KV-21A could be Ankhesenamun, who was Nefertiti's daughter, as well as King Tut's wife. If so, it stands to reason that the other mummy, KV-21B, found alongside her could be Queen Nefertiti herself. Nefertiti was believed to be somewhere around 45 years old when she dropped off the historical record. Interestingly, experts who have analyzed KV-21B concluded that she was about 45 years old at the time of her death. Unfortunately, the DNA sample that was initially taken was too degraded to yield any usable data at the time. In the intervening years, however, scientists have made rapid progress in the ability to analyze DNA from degraded samples. Hawass announced in 2022 that his team had obtained new samples from KV-21B and other remains and would soon be in the position to reveal results. He confidently stated that by comparing the genetic profiles of known mummies, like Akhenaten and other relatives, they expect to name Nefertiti's mummy at last. At present, the results of this testing hasn't been released to the public, and it's unclear if the current samples taken yielded usable DNA evidence. At any rate, if Zahi Hawass is correct, Nefertiti's mummy may already have been discovered, and perhaps the mystery is just awaiting DNA confirmation. That would solve one piece of the puzzle, her physical remains, but not necessarily pinpoint the location of her original tomb. If 21b is in fact Nefertiti, it's not entirely clear whether the KV-21 tomb site was her initial burial site, or a later place her body was moved to by loyalists. The tomb is generally viewed as lacking sufficient grandeur for someone of Nefertiti's status, suggesting that there may be a more significant site that has yet to be discovered. Scattered across the former territories of the Roman Empire, archaeologists have unearthed mysterious 12-sided objects known to modern scholars as Roman dodecahedrons. Each of the 12 faces has a circular hole in the center, and the holes vary in diameter. The faces connect to form a hollow interior, and at each of the 20 vertices there's usually a small spherical knob or protrusion. The metal dodecahedrons are often decorated with geometric patterns, circles, lines, or dots engraved around the holes, but none bear any written inscriptions or numerical markings. They also rarely show signs of wear or damage, likely suggesting they weren't heavily used as tools. But hang tight, we're going to go down the rabbit hole in a moment. Chronologically, Roman dodecahedrons date to the 2nd through 4th centuries AD, placing them in the late Roman Empire period. The first documented discovery of such a dodecahedron was made in 1739 in England, and antiquarians at the time were as puzzled by the object as we remain today. Since that 18th century find, scholars and collectors have identified over 100 of these artifacts across Europe. Despite their identical geometric shape, each dodecahedron is unique. They differ slightly in size, hole diameter, decoration, and proportions, as if individually crafted, rather than mass-produced from a single template. Notably, the craftsmanship required to cast a complex hollow dodecahedron with even thin walls and protruding knobs is considerable. It would have demanded a skilled metalworker and a substantial amount of bronze, indicating that these were costly objects likely made to order rather than cheap common trinkets. Part of the dodecahedron mystery lies in where they've been found and the contexts of their discovery. Strikingly, these artifacts are geographically concentrated in the northern and western provinces of the Roman Empire. Examples have turned up in Britain, northern France, the Low Countries, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and as far east as Hungary. None have been conclusively documented in the heartland of the empire or in the eastern Mediterranean lands. This distribution map is one of our strongest clues. It suggests that whatever purpose the dodecahedron served was particularly relevant to the Romano-Celtic populations in northwest Europe. This has led some scholars to speculate that the objects might have had a specific cultural function in Romano-Celtic society, emerging from the fusion of Roman and indigenous traditions. In terms of archaeological context, dodecahedrons have been uncovered in a variety of settings, but unfortunately, in many cases, the precise context was poorly recorded. A number of specimens were discovered in the 18th and 19th centuries by amateur investigators, who often kept them as curiosities, but failed to document where they found them. Nonetheless, where context is known, it varies widely. Some dodecahedra come from Roman forts or garrisons, others from civilian towns, and a few from rural farmsteads or villas. In at least one case, one of them has been found in a grave, suggesting it had been intended as something for the deceased to take with them to the afterlife. Several dodecahedrons have turned up as part of coin hoards, buried alongside Roman coins. Finding them amid treasure troves of coins hints that their owners considered these objects valuable possessions, possibly items worth hiding or safeguarding, much like money. The question of what these objects were used for has sparked a debate that has now gone on for 3 centuries, and to this day, no consensus exists. Interestingly, no written description of these objects survives in any known Roman literature or inscriptions. Thus, every proposed answer is essentially an educated guess based on the dodecahedron's form and the circumstances of the find. Over the years, archaeologists, historians, and enthusiastic amateurs have put forward a wide range of theories for how these items were used. And before I get into the theories, there's been literally hundreds of plausible proposed usages for these objects, and I encourage you to propose your own in the comments as well. One popular idea is that dodecahedrons were optical devices used by Roman engineers to estimate distances. The user might sight a distant object through pairs of opposite holes. Since each face's hole is a different diameter, one could choose the hole that just fits the object in view, thereby roughly gauging the object's distance. Alternatively, they might have been used to survey land and lay out military camps using simple geometric principles. While intriguing, this theory faces challenges. Notably, no dodecahedron has any engraved calibration marks or numbers that one would expect on a measuring instrument. Further, if this was the case, one would expect the items to be found all over the Mediterranean world, rather than confined to regions with Celtic populations. Early historians, upon first encountering these strange objects, thought they might be related to weapons. They suggested that it may have been a type of projectile to be hurled by a sling or artillery piece. However, the artifacts are generally too lightweight, some weigh only a few dozen grams, and are too intricately made to serve as effective weapons. Further, none show the impact damage or wear one would expect if they had been used in this way. Thus, modern scholars dismiss the weapon hypothesis as implausible. A related martial theory suggests they weren't weapons, but a base for military standards. For example, as a decorative base to hold the staff of the legion's eagle standard. Yet, no legionary standard recovered from antiquity includes such an item, and standard poles typically use simpler, more robust fittings. This idea, while theoretically possible, remains unsupported by any direct evidence, and again faces the geographic issue discussed previously. A few examples have been found with traces of wax residue inside, which hints that someone in antiquity might have used them as a candle holder. The hollow center could accommodate a lump of wax, and the many holes would allow light to emanate outward in patterns. The protruding knobs might even serve to rest the object on a surface or to lift it when hot. However, skeptics note that a bronze dodecahedron has an open bottom. Any candle drippings would just fall out, and no obvious handle or hanger for use as a lamp. The candle holder theory remains a plausible partial explanation for how some people repurpose these objects, but it may not have been their primary intended function. Among the more creative practical theories is that dodecahedrons served as textile tools. Specifically, some have suggested they were used for knitting gloves or weaving, functioning like a multi-spool knitting loom. In modern times, small wooden frames with pegs can produce a tubular knit. Perhaps the Romans, this theory argues, used the holes and knobs of the bronze dodecahedron in a similar way to knit seamless woolen gloves for cold northern winters. Experimental archaeology enthusiasts have indeed managed to knit a rudimentary glove using a replica dodecahedron, demonstrating it's physically possible. Proponents point out that it's no coincidence these objects are absent in the warmer Mediterranean. They mostly appear in colder climates where gloves would be useful. However, this theory faces a chronological snag. The technique of spool knitting isn't documented until the 16th century, and we have no evidence the Romans used this method. Of course, it's always possible that this was a technology that was lost in late antiquity or the early Middle Ages. After all, this was an extremely turbulent period where a lot of knowledge was lost in the former regions of the empire where the dodecahedrons are found. A simpler possibility is that these were leisure items, perhaps a kind of game dice or tossing toy. A few scholars have wondered if the dodecahedron could be a specialized die for a game now lost to history. The 12 faces might correspond to something, in a game of chance or divination. We know that Romans did use polyhedral dice, so a 12-sided die isn't far-fetched at all. However, all known Roman gaming dice have their faces clearly marked with numbers or symbols, something the dodecahedrons notably lack. Moreover, the dodecahedron's faces are punctured with holes, which would make them roll oddly and inconsistently. Another intriguing theory, albeit highly speculative, suggests Roman dodecahedrons may have functioned similarly to speculative asset classes. In this scenario, they were like Dutch tulips in the 17th century or modern cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Under this theory, these objects could have been intentionally crafted without practical utility, their value derived purely from rarity, mystery, and perception rather than tangible usefulness. The craftsmanship of dodecahedrons may have made them attractive for speculative trade or investment among wealthy Roman citizens or collectors. If this theory is true, I like to imagine these Romano-Celtic regions had dodecahedron bros who were eager to explain the future use cases of these items. Their appearance in coin hoards supports this theory to some degree, implying that at least some Romans viewed them as sufficiently valuable to be concealed alongside currency. Much like contemporary speculative bubbles, the exact mechanism for their valuation would have depended on cultural fascination and a sense of a fear of missing out. Though there's no direct textual evidence supporting such speculation-driven value, this theory intriguingly frames the dodecahedrons as ancient predecessors of modern financial instruments. In the absence of a clear practical purpose, many archaeologists turn to the explanation of last resort. Perhaps the dodecahedrons were ritual or religious objects. They could have served as sacred symbols, divination devices, or ceremonial items in a local cult. Notably, the concentration of finds in Celtic-influenced regions has led to the idea that they were tied to Celtic religious practices under Roman rule. For instance, they might have been used by Druids or Gallo-Roman priests for fortune-telling or astrology. Alternatively, they may have been magical charms of some particular significance to Celtic populations. A less discussed but sensible idea is that dodecahedrons had no functional purpose at all. If this is the case, the beauty of these items is precisely that they didn't do anything whatsoever, and that they might be the result of craftsmanship for its own sake. There are two main variants on this line of thought, and I'm going to start with the more obscure theory first. Some have speculated that these were showpieces made by master metalworkers to demonstrate their skill in casting complex geometric shapes. And before I get into this theory, it's important to note that the Roman depictions of Celtic people always portrayed them as producing high-quality metalworkers. This is a characterization that went back to the era of the Roman Republic, during the earliest interactions with the Celtic people who inhabited what is now northern Italy. It's been speculated that making one of these complex items may have served as a proof of skill to become a master metalworker. It was undoubted proof that a craftsman had mastered difficult angles and hollow casting, skills which were highly in demand. In the same vein, others have speculated that showing off a Roman dodecahedron could have served as a portfolio for a craftsman. Further supporting this interpretation is the notable individuality of each discovered dodecahedron. No two are exactly alike in size, hole diameter, or decorative details, indicating personal craftsmanship rather than standardized mass production. Thus, under this theory, the dodecahedron became both an ad and a credential, announcing to the ancient world where one stood on the artisanal pecking order. It was physical proof that the individual was a craftsman of the highest caliber, and as always, it's better to show rather than to tell. Another related theory is that they're simply art, and not intended to have any specific practical function. As I mentioned earlier, Celtic people were highly respected by the Romans for their ability to produce master craftsmen. As a brief aside, these Celtic people weren't simply producing functional items either, but works of high art. Celtic torques, which are neck rings which were used to show off wealth and status as far back as the pre-Roman Celtic world, were renowned throughout the Mediterranean world. By the time the dodecahedrons were being produced, many Celtic people had been thoroughly integrated into the Roman world. This may have allowed these craftsmen to level up their abilities across the generations, especially combined with Hellenic geometric understanding. The objects have a kind of mathematical beauty that could have been admired for their aesthetics in a wealthy household. If they were display pieces, their value would be aesthetic or intellectual rather than utilitarian. The fact that many were kept carefully, even hoarded, might indicate they were treasured as conversation pieces or status symbols. This theory is hard to verify or refute. It essentially suggests the dodecahedron is a product of art for art's sake in the Gallo-Roman world. Considering the expense of metal and the cost of time of a highly skilled craftsman, this wouldn't have been common, but perhaps a few rich enthusiasts enjoyed puzzling objects. While this theory is tempting, it once again potentially fails to account for the geographic distribution of the items. Due to their satisfying geometry, the objects appear to be universally aesthetic, and not something that would just appeal to Celtic tastes. Given that they appear over the course of hundreds of years, it seems likely that this cultural fascination would have spread beyond Celtic regions into other parts of the Roman world. However, it's always a possibility that since the cultural fascination arose in the Celtic part of the Roman world, the form of art may have been viewed as unsophisticated by many Romans. That said, this seems unlikely, since Roman writers, who were universally writing to appeal to elite tastes, had long praised the metalworking ability of Celtic people. Having a genuine Celtic crafted piece seems like it may have been a plus for a dodecahedron, and elite Romans loved showing off their vast array of foreign goods. The mystery of the Roman dodecahedron hasn't been lost on modern scholars, and it features regularly in both academic research and popular history discussions. Modern academic opinion, in the absence of hard evidence, tends to catalog the dodecahedron as an unsolved mystery. In museums, labels often list multiple possible uses without committing to one, instead letting the observer figure out what they thought they may have been used for. Despite the lack of a clear answer, the serious study of these objects continues, and every new find potentially holds the clue to solving this ancient mystery. But of course, perhaps the last thing that needs to be discussed is the most important. What evidence would definitively prove what the purpose of these objects was? To finally solve the mystery of the Roman dodecahedron, historians need a clear, undeniable piece of evidence. Ideally, this would be something from the Romans themselves. It remains a distinct possibility that there's a lost manuscript waiting to be found that discusses what these are and what they were used for. Notably, during and after the 4th century, a great degree of Roman writing ended up shifting towards Christian theological debates. If the dodecahedrons were used for pagan ritual practices in Celtic regions, as has been suggested, it's conceivable that we could discover a new manuscript that documents or denounces them. The fact that many writings from antiquity are transmitted to us through monks making copies in the Middle Ages means this is a distinct possibility, since religious texts were prioritized. Another possibility is finding an ancient inscription with instructions specifically explaining what the dodecahedrons did. This would immediately settle the debate, similar to how ancient tablets helped historians understand Mesopotamian artifacts that had long puzzled them. Another way to crack the case would be discovering dodecahedrons alongside other objects that we already understand well. For example, if archaeologists uncovered several dodecahedrons stored next to known surveying tools or measuring instruments, it would strongly suggest they served a similar function. Basically, finding the Roman dodecahedron in its proper context, alongside something we already know, would potentially finally solve one of ancient history's most puzzling mysteries. Until then, we're left speculating, waiting for that one piece of evidence to emerge from the past, which would let all the puzzle pieces fall into place. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like and subscribe and share this video with your friends and family.